Hi Crystal. I'm going to talk to you about some of the ideas that I've come up with for your essay. So obviously you're looking at whether or not the suffragettes really needed to get more radical in their actions in order to get the female vote in 1918. So I've kind of split it between yes, they did need to get more radical, and I've got a number of reasons why I think that is correct, and no, the fact that they didn't need to get more radical. So I'm just going to talk you through what I've put on the board. Hope this doesn't make you feel sick. Okay, so firstly, their peaceful democratic campaigning didn't work. So years of petitions and letters and marches, leaflets, the sort of galas and things that they did were all continuously ignored. And so therefore they needed to get more radical. Secondly, the fact that they were kind of campaigning within a paternalistic, male-dominated political system, and also kind of a male-dominated elite which ran the newspapers and the popular press, meant that the sort of society and government didn't see the need to change. The fact that Asquith was the Prime Minister for much of this period and he was totally anti-women's suffrage had a big part to play. You've got the reactions from the male-dominated press and reactions from men. And I think particularly for working class women, working class men would often be very much against this. They saw it as really sort of terrible if their wives went off and joined the suffragettes. So, and for working class women, the suffragists didn't really appeal to them either. Working class women couldn't sort of go out and get arrested. You know, they had children to feed and jobs to do, so it wasn't something that they could join. So the kind of male-dominated society has a big part to play in this, and explains why they therefore needed to literally sort of bang the men on the head with the Votes for Women campaign. So, you know, that's why they started to become more and more and more kind of radical in their approach, because the men just didn't see the need to change the system. The next reason that I think they had to become more radical is to do with kind of historically, in order to create radical change, people need to use more radical techniques. So, I mean, today the suffragettes might be called terrorists because, you know, literally they tried to set fire to libraries. Well, they did set fire to libraries and public buildings. They were destroying famous works of art, for example, the Rokeby Venus. They bombed Lloyd George's house. You've got, you know, Emily Wilding Davis throwing herself in front of a horse and dying in front of the public. These are very, very radical actions. And historically, this is what people have used in order to create change. So, for example, you know, men, in order to get the vote, set up the Chartist movement, which was initially supposed to be peaceful, democratic campaign, but ended up having to be much more, well, not having to be, but ended up becoming much more violent. And potentially women were kind of inspired by what had happened before. You'd need to sort of see whether or not any historians kind of argue that point of view. So there's that particular point of view. Another reason why women why the radical actions were necessary is because Parliament repeatedly either ignored the issue or pushed it to one side, seeing other issues as more important. And their use of violence kept this issue continually in the public. And also they became more violent because they were so frustrated at the fact that Parliament kept ignoring this. So the Liberal government had, I think, was something like 400 out of the 650 MPs were actually supporting Votes for Women. So kind of that fact alone demonstrates that the Votes for Women campaign had begun to change men's attitudes, but the government was still pushing it to one side. So in 1909, the suffrage bill was brought to Parliament, But unfortunately, it didn't get enough debating time because Lloyd George was at the same time trying to get through something called the People's Budget to get in place a national insurance scheme. In order to get that People's Budget through, to cut a long story short, it was so difficult for him to do that and to change kind of the Parliament's opinions on that there were several elections. And so the suffragettes issue kept being put to one side. So there was a conciliation bill in 1910 which was supposed to discuss it. That was put to one side because of a general election. It was brought out again in 1911, again put to one side. In 1913, a male suffrage bill was put forward, but the Speaker of the House of Commons basically said, well, you can't just kind of add women onto that. You've got to have like a bill just for women. All of these things frustrated the women and made particularly the WSPU so angry that they turned to increasing violence. And if you look at the timeline of events, then you'll see that there's a direct correlation between the politics and the increase in violence. So kind of I would say that their action felt necessary because they just kept getting pushed to one side. So their violence kept things in the public eye. You've got things like the horror of Black Friday, which is when women went to complain about the conciliation bill. They gathered outside Parliament and the police just basically came and used their batons and just attacked the women, and many of them had broken bones because of how violent the police were. You've also got the hunger strikes and the Cat and Mouse Act, which you've talked about in your essay, and the death of Emily Wilding Davison, which can also kind of be linked to these things. The final thing I was thinking about for the radical actions being necessary is about publicity. Obviously, increasing radical action gained more publicity for the suffragettes. And, you know, you might say all publicity is good, yeah? So, you know, for example, the support for Emily Wilding Davison, when her funeral happened at Morpeth, she, you know, you mentioned in your essay, you know, the huge crowd of people. And I'm sure in your essay you've got some other sort of local things that talk about that. I'm going to stop this video now because otherwise it's going to end up too long to load, and I'll carry on with part 2 in a minute.